Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We're covering a lot here on the program, and before we get to our main case, the Shaun Harrison case, I want to take a step back to update you about another case that we are going to be live in later on in the program, and that is the Claude Tex MacGyver case out of Atlanta. A case that we featured prominently here on the network. We covered it gavel to gavel. We covered every single second of it. It was about a prominent Atlanta attorney who was on trial for the murder of his wife, Diane MacGyver. It was alleged that he shot her intentionally from the back seat of a moving car. She was in the front passenger seat, her friend was driving, and Tex MacGyver, the defendant, was in the back seat. He took out a gun while they were driving because of some disturbance, some sort of, they were entering into a bad neighborhood. That's what the defense said. And the defense said that he fell asleep with the gun and it accidentally went off, shooting and killing her. Now, the prosecution said that this was all intentional murder, that he planned to kill his wife for financial gain. Well, the jury came back with a verdict. What was that verdict? Let's play that for you now.
On count one, murder, we find the defendant not guilty. On count two, felony murder, we find the defendant guilty of felony murder. On count three, aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On count four, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, we find the defendant guilty. On count five, influencing a witness, we find the defendant guilty.
Thank you, Judge. Why don't you take a seat, Deputy.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Tex MacGyver was found guilty of felony murder, guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and guilty of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, as well as one count of influencing a witness. He was found guilty of that as well. So today, we're going to be covering it later on in the program, is his sentencing hearing. And what could he face? The prosecution has requested, they recommended that he be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. However, Judge McBurney in this case could decide to sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, Mr. MacGyver is 74 years old. So even if he's granted life in prison with the possibility of parole, he won't get parole for 30 years. That's a life sentence for him. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison unless his defense team can mount a successful appeal, and they've already said that they plan to file a motion for a new trial. Let's analyze a little bit more about this case with my very special guest, a very good friend of the program, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, great to have you on. Excuse me. So what do you think about this case as we enter into the sentencing phase?
It hasn't changed much since the last time we spoke. I'm, like many people, you know, kind of not necessarily shocked, but kind of scratching my head over the verdict. It is what it is, and you have to stand by what the court has stated. That's neither here nor there at this point. I'm wondering if some of the facts relative to intent and all this sort of thing are going to play in as a mitigating factor relative to sentencing. I'm with you. I mean, this either way, this is a life behind bars for Mr. MacGyver at this point in the stage in his life, even, you know, with the possibility of parole. I'm not so much interested in the sentencing phase at this point as I am what you brought up relative to the appeal process. And I think that we're going to find out what the prosecution case is really made of at this point when it goes into this phase. It'll have to come up on appeal. I don't see them actually getting a new trial necessarily, but it's going to play out quite interesting. Just from a forensic standpoint, I still have not been convinced that this man went out specifically with intent to kill his wife, because this kind of circumvents all reasoning as far as I'm concerned as an investigator, why you would choose to shoot an individual through a seat and hit her in what is traditionally, well, it's kind of, there's no guarantee that this is going to be a lethal shot. Remember, she was shot in her lower posterior area of her back, and it traversed, clipped some vital vessels in there, and she essentially exsanguinated, as it's stated, or bled to death. And so I just, it's really hard for me to understand this. And
yeah, it was hard for a lot of our viewers and even us to understand if someone wanted to kill their wife, why do it in this fashion in a public place, in a moving car, with the best friend of the victim driving the car. It seemed to be a lot of questions. And by the way, for anybody that wants a really interesting interview, our very own Aaron Keller interviewed one of the jurors. You can go to lawandcrime.com to see that. And you be the judge. Was the jury confused as to the law when they rendered their verdict? Maybe. You might want to take a look at that. It was a very colorful and interesting interview. But Joseph, it will be interesting to see on appeal, and we believe there was a lot of different appealable issues. If it will be successful, and again, he's an older gentleman, will he be able to mount his defense in enough time? That becomes a question too. Now, Joseph, I want you to stand by. We're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about the Shaun Harrison case. Again, this is about that reverend, okay? This reverend, this Boston pastor who's on trial for a lot of different crimes, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that Harrison tried to shoot him in the back of the head, execution style, back in 2015. We have a live feed in that courtroom right now. On the stand is Sergeant Richard Medina from the Boston Police. And this is, again, a key witness in this case, trying to investigate why they believe this man, Shaun Harrison, excuse me, the Reverend, the Rev, is guilty of these really horrible crimes. Let's go live. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. You are listening and watching to a live feed in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a reverend who has been dubbed as a secret drug kingpin, that he was operating a drug enterprise while being a dean at a high school, and he enlisted the help of several young men to help him in this enterprise. He's on trial also for allegedly shooting a high school student named Luis Rodriguez in the back of the head, trying to kill him because of a dispute over decreased drug sales. It's alleged that Rodriguez was one of his sales associates. Now, on the stand is Sergeant Medina. Sergeant Medina investigated an interesting aspect of this case. There were several people that were spotted outside of or leaving Mr. Harrison's apartment. These were Dante Lara, Wilson Peguera Jr., and Oscar Pena. Now, charges against these three men, they were indicted, they were dropped, but it's interesting what they found. They found a series of marijuana and guns and cell phones on these men, and they're trying to link these individuals to Harrison. Perhaps these were associates of his, and that becomes the question, how these individuals are related to Harrison and how they may be related to the shooting, because these items were found, including a gun, guns found after the shooting. So Sergeant Medina is on the stand. We'll jump back in a second. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, the collection of evidence in this case is interesting. I mean, guns, ammunition, drugs, they were all found in Harrison's apartment. What do you think of it?
Well, these are all going to be tiebacks to one central point of convergence, is the way we like to frame it in forensics. And this puts the alleged perpetrator in the same space with the victim, say, for instance, in this particular case, particularly if you have, which is highly, you had said a mouthful a moment ago, Jesse, when you referred to miraculously this kid is still alive after he sustained a gunshot wound to the back of the head. If they were able to recover, say, the round that struck this kid, which I don't know if they were or not able to, that can actually tie back to a weapon that is recovered because it's got a specific ballistic signature on it with the lands and grooves and those things that you hear about. Also, this clothing that was mentioned, I'm very interested to find out what the nature of it is, if it's being hidden in some way, if there's some kind of trace evidence that's contained on there, potentially blood evidence, or is there some type of firearm evidence that might be on there, say like powder that's unburned, and that's going to be key. Everything comes down to tying everything back on the part of the prosecution, and it can't simply be done just based on the science. It's a combination of the science and good old-fashioned shoe leather that the detectives apply to this case when they're questioning these suspects and tie it back with the physical evidence, and this hopefully will present a compelling case.
Yeah, they're in a sidebar right now in that courtroom waiting for the feed to go back. Joseph, hopefully I can ask you real quick, how is it possible, if this is all true, that Harrison did shoot Rodriguez in the head, how could Rodriguez survive that?
Well, you know, that's curious, Jesse. One of the things I'm wondering about is, remember I was talking about the attitude of the physical attitude between the weapon and the victim. Did the kid move at one moment, and this was more of a glancing kind of blow, more of what we refer to as an oblique shot that kind of bounced off of the side of the head that didn't penetrate the skull fully? Was it defective ammunition? There's a lot of questions to be answered here.
But you know what? The shooter, whoever the shooter was, whether it was Harrison or somebody else, that shot had to look like the person was actually dead. So the victim, Rodriguez, whatever his condition looked like when he was shot, he had to appear to be dead. Otherwise, why not finish the job? Yeah, exactly. And let's keep in mind, you know, to be, you know, if someone tries to say, well, gee, I wonder what kind of impact this has to be, you know, and I could fail, my words would fail to say something like, well, it's like being hit in the back of the head with a sledgehammer. If it knocks him or renders him unconscious for a moment, it could give that appearance. Absolutely. And it's not something, I mean, we saw Rodriguez testify. It's not an easy thing. Not an easy thing to think about, and not an easy thing to even think about going through. What we're going to do, Joseph, I want you to stand by. There's nothing really happening in the court right now. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot to analyze in the Shaun Harrison case, including we'll have our live feed back and go learn a little bit more about the Harrison enterprise. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, guiding you through the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. That's the main case we're covering here. That's our live feed right now. The Reverend, the Rev, as he likes to be called, was a dean at a high school, living a normal life, when really the prosecution says he was actually a drug kingpin. He was employing young sales associates, high school students, to do his bidding. And one of those was a man named Luis Rodriguez, a high school student, who it's alleged that Mr. Harrison shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And why? Because of decreased drug sales. He was unhappy with his performance. Well, Mr. Harrison is facing a number of different charges, and we have a live feed into the courtroom right now. Sergeant Medina is on the stand, and this is a key officer who investigated some members who might be sales associates or associates of the defendant. Let's go live.
The screen.
Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. For all of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, Sergeant Richard Medina is on the stand. This is the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a reverend who is on trial for a lot of different drug and gun charges, as well as an attempted murder charge. This sergeant investigated some drug dealers that were affiliated with Harrison, or seemingly affiliated with Harrison, and the text messages on their recovered cell phones were just analyzed. I want to let our listeners know that one of those messages was from Harrison saying, "The dough is in my brown suit in the living closet." Again, the prosecution is trying to tie the Reverend, the Rev, to a criminal enterprise, a criminal drug enterprise, as well as to a shooting. It is alleged that Harrison shot a young high school student named Luis Rodriguez in the back of the head, execution style, that Rodriguez was one of his accomplices, one of his drug associates that he hired to sell marijuana for him. It's alleged they got into a dispute over decreased drug sales, and Harrison wanted him dead. There's a silence in the courtroom right now as they go through some of the evidence. So let me see if I can bring in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph's a forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. We're looking at some of those text messages, not looking so good for the defendant.
No, I think the one that kind of stands out is the one that states that the dough is in the suit pocket. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it's this idea of connectivity. A lot of people, I think, out there, think that, you can just kind of throw science up against a wall, you can throw investigative information up against a wall, and the jury's going to buy it all. But what has to happen relative to the prosecution and all of this evidence is that they literally have to paint a picture or weave this together. I like to think about it as little threads when I teach my classes at Jacksonville State. So you weave all of this together to create this kind of tapestry.
Well, Joseph, let's just to clarify here. When we said that there was the dough is in my brown suit in the living closet, I interpret that to mean money. Could that be drugs?
Well, maybe so, or maybe he was getting ready to bake bread. I don't know, but in the common vernacular, when I hear dough, I'm thinking money. But many times there'll be some kind of coded language for people that are working in drug deals, and you don't know. Maybe it's there to put it off scent. But I would think the first thing my mind would flee to as an investigator would probably be money in this particular case.
Yeah, the exchange of money with people that have guns and drugs on them. When you're a good old reverend, the appearance of impropriety is not so good.
No, it's not, and it paints even a kind of a more insidious picture of this individual. If this is in fact the case, he had kind of preached this nonviolence thing, anti-gun thing, and this is documented throughout. You can even see things about him on YouTube relative to this, and so it goes to a bigger picture, doesn't it, Jesse? Relative to kind of what was hiding in the dark behind here, and then that you would take a teenage kid out there and allegedly attempt to execute him, which makes this all the more monstrous, I think.
What I don't understand is if he really was engaging in a criminal enterprise and had all these different associates who were selling drugs for him, and he had guns and all this stuff, why would he tell people, why would he tell students that he was going to kill Luis Rodriguez? Why do that if this is actually true?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm almost having visions of a Denzel Washington movie, like Training Day or something, where he's essentially putting this idea out there where he's the boss, he's in charge, and he's going to make an example out of somebody if that is in fact the case. To keep other people in line, as let's reflect back to what was stated. One of the things that's been put forth here, Jesse, is the idea that sales have been slipping in this particular case. So he's going to make an example out of someone, and he chose this young man. Maybe they had another an argument or something. And something else I'm very interested in, when this young man made it into the hospital, I wonder if there was any kind of other evidence of injury.
Well, that's an interesting perspective about what else did this guy suffer, this victim, because we know he was tackled at the high school by another student, and that it's alleged that that student that attacked him was under the orders, the direction of Mr. Harrison. Joseph, stand by. We have a live feed back in the courtroom. Sergeant Medina, one of the key officers in this case who investigated drug dealers that may be affiliated with Harrison, is back on the stand, so let's listen in live.
They were.
Back to Law and Crime, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. You're listening and watching to a live feed into the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's on trial for drug charges, gun charges, as well as an attempted murder charge. Now, on the stand is Sergeant Richard Medina. He's talking about a few things here. So, again, Shaun Harrison is on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student named Luis Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head. These three individuals, Dante Lara, Wilson Peguero Jr., and Oscar Pena, were arrested by Sergeant Medina. But the case was thrown out when a judge, when it was determined that this was all a part of an illegal search, that this was an improper search and seizure. And so what's interesting, this was an illegal stop and frisk, I should say, but what did they find in the course of that in the course of that search? They found guns, they found cell phones, they found drugs. And how is that tied to Mr. Harrison? Well, they were leaving Harrison's apartment. We also know that there was text message conversations between the two, including one where Harrison said, "The dough," which could mean money, maybe it means drugs, "is in my jacket pocket." It's really interesting to hear this back and forth, as well as the fact that guns and drugs are on people that are affiliated with the good old Reverend, who claims that he is an anti-gun and anti-violent activist, and he had nothing to do with any of the crimes that he is alleged to have been committed, to have been committed. We are going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. This reverend, this Boston pastor, is on trial for numerous crimes, including gun charges, drug charges, as well as attempted murder charge in connection with the shooting of Luis Rodriguez, a high school student. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison was operating a double life as a drug kingpin, hired Mr. Rodriguez to be one of his sales associates, his drug dealers, selling marijuana for him on the side, when they got into a dispute over decreased drug sales. It's alleged that Harrison decided to take action into his own hands, and he lured Rodriguez out one night and shot him in the back of the head, execution style. On the stand right now, we have a live feed, is Sergeant Richard Medina. This is a guy who did an illegal search and frisk of 3 individuals, Dante Lara. I want to make sure I get their names 100% right here, so bear with me. Dante Lara, what is his other name? Dante Lara, Wilson Peguero Jr., and Oscar Pena. 3 individuals that were leaving Harrison's apartment, and guns were found on them, as well as drugs and cell phones that indicated a conversation that they had with Harrison. Also, a police scanner was found on them as well. Let's go back live into the courtroom and we can learn a little bit more. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. You're watching and listening to a live feed into the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a Boston pastor that faces many different charges, including attempted murder. On the stand is Sergeant Richard Medina, a man who arrested 3 teens, 3 individuals that were seen leaving Harrison's apartment. Because Harrison is believed to have been leading a double life, one as a reverend and a school educator, and as the other life as a drug kingpin. Now, these 3 individuals had guns on them, cell phones, drugs, and the cell phone showed that they had a conversation with Harrison, and anything that can tie them to Harrison, showing that he was part of this illegal operation, is very interesting. It should also be noted that they may have had matching tattoos with Harrison, and a police scanner was found on their person as well. Some of that evidence that was collected in that arrest is being looked at right now, but it should be noted that those 3 individuals, those charges were dropped against them because of an illegal stop and frisk, an illegal search there. So let's go back live into the courtroom where we can learn a little bit more about these individuals and their connection with the defendant. Welcome back, everybody. This is Jesse Weber here at Law and Crime, looking into and watching a live feed into the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. I want to bring back on Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. As we look at the live feed in the courtroom of Sergeant Medina, who arrested 3 individuals that may have been had a connection to the defendant, what do you make of this? And again, we should let our viewers and our listeners know that Shaun Harrison, the defendant, is a reverend who's accused of leading a double life as a drug dealer and an assassin, I should say. He was alleged to have tried to kill someone. So what do you make of this evidence that we're looking at right now?
Yeah, one of the things that's so compelling for me, Jesse, dare I use the word confederacy? In this case, you've got all of these kind of peripheral players that apparently are part of his merry band of men here that are going out and perpetrating drug sales and all these other things. And this is, it's very sad that this young man was shot, but there's something even more insidious here. I find it interesting that he touted himself as a peacemaker and kind of a community activist, and he's essentially allegedly injecting this drug culture into the same space in which he preaches against nonviolence and all this sort of thing. One other point I want to bring out here, I found it really interesting that they're recovering these weapons. They mentioned a couple of them. We had a 9mm, we had a 38. I was kind of joking a little bit when I said Confederacy, but let's keep in mind, if he's running a drug enterprise, Jesse, I really wonder how many of these other weapons may be tied back to other crimes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be homicide. It can be events where folks have been witnessed with similar weapons in their hand, or maybe menacing individuals, or shooting to injure individuals. If they recover ballistic evidence as being displayed here with these spent shell casings, in other cases, are there tiebacks to other cases, things that are actively unsolved? And I'd be curious to know if the authorities had in fact done searches through the ATF to see if they have anything out there that ties it back to these other weapons involved in this case.
What's so interesting is the Sergeant Medina, who's on the stand talking about evidence that was collected from 3 individuals, Dante Lara, Wilson Peguero Jr., and Oscar Pena. They weren't able to be, their charges were dismissed because of an illegal stop and frisk. So all of that information, even though it's being brought in right now to try to attach them to Harrison, it must be so frustrating when you can't attach that information, attach that evidence then because of an illegal search. So, Joseph, stand by. We're going to go back live into the courtroom. Again, the evidence that was collected from that arrest is being looked at right now. Let's go live. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we are going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, but we're going to be back here in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Again, a Boston pastor who is on trial for many different crimes, including attempted murder. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a Boston pastor who's in some hot water. He's on trial for a lot of different crimes, including attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that he shot him in the back of the head execution style because the Reverend is actually, this is what's alleged, a drug kingpin. He was living a double life as a big drug dealer, and he was employing the help of different students at the high school where he was one of the deans to help him in this criminal enterprise. On the stand right now is Sergeant Richard Medina. This is an officer who arrested 3 individuals, 3 drug associates that it's believed to be drug associates of Mr. Harrison. And talking about what was found on them, guns, drugs, police scanner, their cell phones, which were analyzed, included a text message from Harrison that said, "The dough is in my jacket pocket of his suit." Now, dough could be drugs, dough could be money, but either way, if you're communicating with people as a good old Reverend, and these people are drug dealers, it's not looking so good for the Rev. Then again, the defense has to put on their case, and really they're saying that this guy, there's no evidence really attaching him to this crime. Sure, there's a surveillance footage of a shooting, it looks like a shooting, but you can't really positively identify their client. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator. Joseph, I might have to cut you off real quick if the feed goes back, but that surveillance footage, you really couldn't tell what was happening at that time, if it was a shooting or not. So what's the best piece of evidence so far from the prosecution tying Harrison to these crimes?
Well, I think that probably what's going to be key here is the physical evidence relative to the firearms, his possession of firearms. That goes to a bigger issue here. And yeah, the CCTV footage is grainy. You can't really, it's non-appreciable as far as an identifier, and that would be quite compelling. It seems many times that that's the case with CCTV. You know, lots of people can't, you can't anticipate what's going to be witnessed out there and at what range these things occur relative to these little cameras. But I think, the association that he has with this young man and witness statements are going to be key in this particular case.
Joseph, let's go back live into the courtroom. Sergeant Medina is speaking to the jury. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as we listen to Sergeant Richard Medina, there's not a lot of action, not a lot of activity going on in the courtroom. He's verifying certain evidence, but he provided some very good testimony at the beginning. Remember, this is the Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who is alleged to have been leading a double life as a drug kingpin. He was selling marijuana, and he was also alleged to have tried to kill a high school student by shooting him in the back of the head. Sergeant Richard Medina, after the shooting, arrested 3 individuals that might have had a connection to Harrison. Let's play you some of his testimony from earlier. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was some earlier testimony in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. So, Reverend Shaun Harrison is a Boston pastor who's on trial for many different crimes, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. So who's Officer Medina? Who's Sergeant Medina? Well, Sergeant Medina arrested 3 individuals after this alleged shooting. And these 3 individuals had guns on them, drugs, cell phones, police scanner, and they seemed to be linked to Harrison. They were exiting his apartment, and there was even cell phone conversations between them, text message conversations between them. So I want to bring back in forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University, and it should be noted for all of our listeners, we do have a live feed into the courtroom, just nothing's happening yet. Sergeant Medina's on the stand, but he's not speaking. As soon as we have some activity, we'll make sure to go back to it. What is the thing, Joseph, that surprises you most about this case?
I think that how far-reaching this guy's impact is on the community, and it's opposite sides of the same coin. You have him saying one thing in public relative to his stance against violence and drugs and all this sort of thing. And then you have him allegedly involved in this lifestyle. There's a tremendous amount, I think, of physical evidence that kind of ties him back to this lifestyle that prosecution is attempting to demonstrate in court here, it can be a bit tedious as we're watching the sergeant on the stand here, but this goes to documentation. And it doesn't have the snappy repartee that people see on television. Many times in court, you're on the stand, it gets rather tedious when you're having to go through every jot and tittle over the, kind of justifying what you've done. And as you spoke to earlier, there was an illegal stop and frisk that kind of eradicated the usefulness of some evidence that ties him back to this group of teenagers, which is kind of sad because you don't know what are the cases these individuals might have been involved in. I can only imagine that for the community up there, it's very shocking because these individuals in the community, they have this one perception of him, but yet he's leading another type of life that the prosecution is attempting to demonstrate here.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about evidence that's useful and how we don't have that useful evidence from these 3 individuals that were arrested because of an illegal stop and frisk. But I got to tell you, Joseph, we found some useful evidence in this case because I want to play our viewers and our listeners the testimony of Chelsea Padano. This is the neighbor of Shaun Harrison, the same reverend who's claimed to have been a drug kingpin who tried to kill a high school student by shooting him in the back of the head. So she, in the days after the shooting, she found something in her storage unit. And what did she find? She found articles of clothing that didn't belong to her, but who had access to her storage unit? The Reverend Shaun Harrison. And were these articles of clothing the ones that he used when he allegedly shot Luis Rodriguez? Maybe. Let's listen a little bit about what happened after Harrison got arrested. This is Chelsea Padano, his neighbor. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. You were listening to testimony of Chelsea Padano, the neighbor of the defendant in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Reverend Shaun Harrison, a Boston pastor who was living one life and now is alleged to have been leading a completely different double life as a drug dealer. He's on trial for gun charges, drug charges, as well as charges related to the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that he wanted to kill Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head execution style because Rodriguez was one of his drug dealers, one of his sales associates. They had a dispute over decreasing numbers, and he wanted him taken out. Now, we've been showing you a live feed into that courtroom, and you've been listening to a live feed in that courtroom. They're currently on break. What we're going to do is we are going to go on break, and when we come back, we are going to play you the testimony of a key witness in this case, a man named Kevin Perez. This was another high school student who knew the victim, who knew the defendant, and was intimately involved in conversations about what was going to happen to Luis Rodriguez and what did the defendant ask Mr. Perez to do. I'll give you a hint. It was to take out, it was to attack, and it was to maybe kill Luis Rodriguez. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Jesse Weber. So what are we learning about right now in that clip? Well, we are learning a lot about the defendant, Shaun Harrison. The Reverend Shaun Harrison, a Boston pastor, is being accused of being a secret drug dealer, a drug kingpin, who enlisted the help of high school students to help him sell this marijuana. But that's not what he's really on trial for. Yes, there are drug charges. Yes, there are even gun charges. But what is he really on trial for? The attempted murder of a boy named Luis Rodriguez, another high school student. Rodriguez was alleged to have been one of his drug associates, and they got into a dispute about decreased drug sales. Harrison wanted him taken out. The person you were just listening to was Kevin Perez, another high school student. He said Harrison approached him to sell marijuana. He said Harrison approached him to attack Luis Rodriguez. This is a very bizarre series of events. So let's try to make a little sense of it. And again, for all of our listeners and our viewers joining us, we cover the live feed in this courtroom, but they're on a break right now. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go back into the court. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. So there's a lot of interesting tidbits of this case. Let's talk about what Kevin Perez just said. He says that Harrison approached him to be one of his drug associates, but not only that, he approached him to take out Luis Rodriguez. You're having high school students being your enforcers? What am I not getting here, Joseph?
I don't know. I don't get it either. I know that one thing when you're dealing with high school students and he's thinking that he's going to be able to keep the covers on this, he's, whistling past the graveyard, as they say. This idea that he would use high school kids to strong arm another high school kid in a drug enterprise is a real head scratcher, isn't it? And this goes to, what kind of injuries did this young man sustain at this particular time? And again, you're building a case here where you're showing a history of violence as it moves forward. What I'm really curious about, Jesse, on the night that this young man was in fact shot and he was subsequently treated, I want to know if, first off, if they documented any injuries other than the gunshot wound that he had sustained that may have been healing that he had been subjected to, and also anything that had happened immediately prior to the gunshot wound. Had he been slapped around? Had he been popped in the face at any point in time? Were there any other injuries that you could document where this guy is using force to try to get this kid to submit to his wishes?
Well, let's take a step back. So Luis Rodriguez, the victim here, he survived this shooting attempt, okay? He survived. He testified in open court last week, pointed towards Harrison, said that's the shooter. But what we learned, was that Rodriguez, shortly before the shooting, was attacked in the high school by another student named Laudy. Now, it's alleged that Harrison ordered Laudy to take out Mr. Rodriguez to do this. Now, we've been showing the footage. I hope we can show it one more time. Maybe we have it for our viewers. They can see. Rodriguez is walking down the high school floors when, bam, he's literally tackled through the bathroom door. The question is, did Harrison direct this? Well, we learned from testimony from a teacher that he just stood by and didn't do anything. So it kind of looks like he may have directed this. But let's learn a little bit more about this attack from Kevin Perez. Again, a crucial witness for the prosecution and another student in the high school. Let's listen. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and we are learning some very interesting things about the defendant in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Again, a Boston pastor who's in some pretty hot water. He's on trial for gun charges, drug charges, and an attempted murder charge. That's right. This guy you see right here, our viewers are looking at him. I hope our listeners afterwards can take a look at him. This guy was a dean in a high school. And it's alleged that he was really leading a separate life as a drug dealer. And one of his drug associates was a boy named Luis Rodriguez. He was having him sell marijuana for him. Got into a dispute about decreased drug sales and tried to take him out by shooting him in the back of the head execution style back in 2015. And what did we just learn from the witness that was on the stand, Kevin Perez, another student in that school? That Kevin Perez said that Harrison approached him with drugs and offered to be one of his drug associates. Also said he wanted him to take out Luis Rodriguez. And then we saw this video. And I know our listeners can't see it, so I hope you go back to lawandcrime.com and look at this video. There's another student named Loudy who Rodriguez is walking down the hallway, and Loudy comes and bam, knocks him, really tackles him so hard into the bathroom door, and all the students come rushing in. The question is, did Harrison direct that attack? Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. I keep looking at this video and I'm shocked by it. Now, one of the things our viewers and listeners may not know is it's alleged that Loudy, after he did this, said, "You messed it all up for us," maybe meaning that this is, meaning you messed it all up for us, the thing that we have going on with Harrison. I got to ask you, Joseph, what do you make of this as we keep watching this video?
Well, first off, they really hammered this kid through this bathroom door. I can't believe he didn't sustain some kind of whiplash injury or head injury at that point in time. As you could see in the video of him testifying last week, he's severely neurologically compromised now, apparently as a result of this gunshot wound. And the menacing nature of the video that we're watching is pretty incredible. And if this kid, in fact, did make this statement, and if it does allude to the relationship, that paints even a grimmer picture, if you will. I'm curious about the young man that's trailing in this, coming up behind. To me, this appears to be the young gentleman that was on the stand. I think the question is, he had already been asked if he would do this. Why is he in such close proximity when this is going on, if he has stated that he declined this offer? Because he's essentially, after the attack takes place, if this is in fact him, he's the first one to be standing over this kid's body. I don't know if he's rendering assistance, if he just happens to be there, or what the case might be. But boy, what in the world is going on in the school? It's quite terrifying.
The question is, what is going on in the school? If this is true, and he really was a drug kingpin enlisting the help of students, I don't mean to laugh, but this is like Breaking Bad. I don't know how this gets right through the cracks. It's pretty unbelievable. But Joseph, listen, thank you so much for joining us. I know we have to sign you off. It was great having you on.
Thank you for having me as well, Jesse.
All right, everybody, here's what we're going to do. We are going to go to a break. When we come back, we have so much more to talk about in this case. I'll be signing off. Rachel Stockman will be signing in. Stay tuned.